what are the risks of pursuing the removal of Maduro without laying that diplomatic groundwork and without those tools in place for managing the aftermath in Venezuela? I noted the month-long planning and rehearsing and understanding that our military, who did a great job, their job, what they did was following through, but it was very well planned. They had a strategy. They rehearsed it over and over and over again. But if you don't have a plan for afterwards, what are the risks that take place thereafter? I'll start with Mr. Shannon.
Thank you very much for the question. I believe we're seeing the risks right now. In other words, a military operation that was planned, practiced, and then executed was not matched by a diplomatic plan that was thought through. And so there's a degree of improvisation at this point where it appears the primary purpose is trying to avoid a significant long-term presence by the United States on the ground, especially the U.S. military, and a need to ensure some degree of order and stability. And so the administration has chosen to work with the remnants of the Maduro regime. The problem this creates is that this is the regime that the administration had vilified as criminal and as a part of a narco-trafficking network and a terrorism network. The people who have been designated, identified, indicted are still in place. And for Venezuelans who are looking for some kind of exit from a political conflict that has consumed that country for nearly 25 years, this is not the exit. And therefore the administration is going to find itself in a position in a very short term in which it is either locked into a relationship with a regime that is not consonant with U.S. interests, or it's going to have to present some plan for a process of political transition, and it has not been able to articulate that. And in the process, absent an open and functioning U.S. embassy in Caracas, absent the ability to surge American diplomats into Caracas, absent an ability to protect them while they're on the ground, absent a USAID, which would have been the natural conduit through which development assistance, accountable development assistance, would have been delivered. We are absent the tools that we would normally use in this kind of process. And so we are at a disadvantage. The regime knows that. They're at great risk right now because of our military might and because of the economic power we still hold over them. However, they operate with a mindset, which is that if they do not surrender, they cannot be beat. And their short-term goal will be that. It will be not to surrender. It will be to make the concessions that are necessary in order to survive, but to hold on to power, because by doing that they protect themselves and they limit the ability of their political opponents to gain any purchase within Venezuela.
Mr. Moore, you want to add anything to that?
Just briefly, Congressman, you indicated basically that there is no strategy here, and I think that's true. There is a sort of incongruence between the goals or what it's trying to achieve in Venezuela, even those are not very clear, and the means and tools. When you have that kind of mismatch between ends and means, you're bound to run into enormous challenges. That's on one side. The second is, and I want to sort of double down on something that Ambassador Shannon said. For the current regime, reform and concessions beyond some of the ones that have been provided is an existential threat for them. They lose everything, and not just power and economic resources and their corrupt networks. They lose everything. And they have done this in the past. They will hedge, they will delay, they will give some concessions, pull back. They will continue repression. We've seen in the last few days, Congressman, that the regime has heightened the levels of repression. Even as they're releasing some political prisoners, they're intensifying the wave of repression. People are being stopped and their phones are being taken to see who they've been interacting with. and if in some way they're interacting or collaborating with the United States. They know that they can repress. If the administration is going to manage or run Venezuela, as is indicated it's going to do, it's going to require a lot more resources that itself has dismantled, as you indicated, and therefore you have this incongruence between the stated objectives and goals and the means to achieve them. Thank you.
Thank you. And good morning, everyone, and I want to thank everyone for being here today and for attending today's special meeting on Venezuela, a meeting that Democrats on the House Foreign Affairs Committee were unfortunately forced to convene. And this is because despite our numerous requests to the committee majority, Republicans have held no public hearings with administration officials on Venezuela in this Congress. No hearings during the months of this administration's illegal bombing of boats in the Caribbean and Pacific to purportedly stop drugs from Venezuela. Though the country is not a primary source of cocaine or fentanyl entering the United States. No hearings in the run-up to the unprecedented military intervention into Venezuela earlier this month that Congress did not authorize. And the chaos since, or what comes next. And no hearings on the administration's ambitions in the Western Hemisphere and how they will avoid dragging us back into the mistakes of a colonial and imperialist past. But let me be clear first that Maduro was an illegitimate authoritarian who lost the elections in 2024 in Venezuela, and not a single person here is crying over his departure or whitewashing his alleged crimes, and will stand firm with the people of Venezuela who demand their rights and look forward and wants to have democracy and the ability to vote and have their votes count. It is Congress' responsibility to conduct oversight of our administration. The Trump administration executed a raid without congressional authorization to abduct Maduro, leaving his repressive regime in place and sidelining opposition voices. It claimed that this was about drugs, and that wasn't true. Then they claimed it was about regime change, and actually, that too has proved not to be true. The only thing that the president has expressed an interest in is Venezuela's oil, and it has failed to develop any credible plan for what comes next, how the United States would protect American interests in our own hemisphere, and how any of these actions help the American people. We are here today to deliberate on these critical matters, including the long-term ramifications of the administration's unauthorized use of military force and what Trump's willingness to put boots on the ground actually means. Will American service members be expected to risk their lives in the future to drive up the stock options of oil barons? Or what will become of Venezuela's entrenched military? Or the many armed groups throughout this country twice the size of Iraq? After decimating the State Department, USAID, and other non-military tools in our arsenal, how will we achieve stability in Venezuela and mitigate spillover risks to our border region, including increased migration and conflict? Now, I've invited and asked Secretary Rubio to come, or anyone else from the administration, to testify so that we could hear from them. And unfortunately, we received a note that they would not attend. As I said earlier, unfortunately, the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee has not held one hearing. So we are joined here today by three esteemed witnesses to help us consider these questions. The Honorable Thomas Shannon, former Acting Secretary of State, Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, U.S. Ambassador to Brazil, and Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs. The Honorable Frank Mora, former U.S. Ambassador to the Organization of American States, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Western Hemisphere Affairs. And the Honorable Bruce Fiducane, Senior Advisor, U.S. Program at the International Crisis Group, and a former Attorney Advisor in the Office of the State Department Legal Advisor. I thank all of you for being here today, and I look forward to your testimony. And I know I speak on behalf of all the members that your insights will be critical for our understanding as we move forward. And I thank you in advance for your answers to the many timely questions that we have. We're trying to just get to the facts to understand so that we can tell the American people what and how we should be moving forward. And I certainly appreciate that. Let me give an opening statement. Okay, but let me first go to the witnesses and have testimony. We'll start out with the Honorable Thomas Shannon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meeks, Chairman, Ranking Member. This is a tremendous honor. I appreciate the chance to be with all of you today, and especially with my colleagues, Frank and Brian, great Americans both, who have served our country with great distinction and honor over time, and continue to care deeply about the trajectory of American power in the world. My comments will be brief. The purpose is really to get to all of your questions and comments. Let me start by saying that the military raid in Caracas and the taking of President Maduro from Caracas to the United States has been characterized as a law enforcement action. Its consequences are much greater than executing an arrest warrant, obviously, both in Venezuela and beyond. But there are a few ways to characterize and understand the events of January 3rd and beyond. The first is, as noted by Mr. Meeks, the raid itself was not an act of regime change. It was an act of leadership change. And it was not a leadership change undertaken within Venezuelan power structures. It was a leadership change undertaken by the United States. And the purpose was to create a more compliant regime. And so what we have right now is the United States engaging with the remnants of the Maduro regime and trying to fashion a way forward that will create order or allow order and stability to prevail in Venezuela while the United States pursues other goals, which at this point have been primarily identified as capturing Venezuela's oil and gas, restarting the Venezuelan economy, and generating enough economic growth to begin to attract the Venezuelans who have fled Venezuela over time, which is about 1/4 of Venezuela's population. As presented so far, the ability of the United States government to engage with the remnants of the regime, with the now acting President Delcy Rodriguez and her government, are largely done through a very narrow range of communication and backed up with threats, both economic and military. I believe that as we look deeper into the future, we need to understand better the nature of the regime we're working with, the nature of Chavismo at this moment in the 21st century, and what possibilities this creates for U.S. success, if any. I do think it's important to understand that in this particular moment, the President's decision to engage with the remnants of the regime and not to engage with the democratic opposition is a mistake. It's a mistake not only because of the legitimacy that members of the democratic opposition like Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia have already established through elections in Venezuela, but also because at the end of the day, if the Venezuelan people don't have a voice in this process, the political volatility of Venezuela will only increase. In other words, this is not a country that can be governed through the existing regime. If we're concerned about governability, if we're concerned about the economic well-being of the Venezuelan people, if we're concerned about how we restart foreign investment and draw Venezuela back into a larger global economy, it has to be accompanied by a political transition that is meaningful, long-term, and holds some degree of hope for Venezuelan people that have been long suffering. And so let me just close by saying that tomorrow's meeting between President Trump and Maria Corina Machado is going to be a watershed moment in terms of what comes next for the United States, but also what comes next for the Venezuelan people. It's my hope that she will be able to emerge from the White House with some kind of endorsement from the President or a clear recognition that the Democratic opposition and the Venezuelan people need to have a seat at the table at this very important moment in Venezuelan history. So thank you very much, sir.
Good morning, Ranking Member, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I want to focus on a central challenge facing U.S. policy toward Venezuela. The assumption implied or explicit that the United States can shape Venezuelan governance, economic outcomes, and a democratic transition from afar, without military presence, without a robust diplomatic footprint, and without a clear political roadmap. Now, as the ranking member said, let me start by being very clear. Venezuela is better off without Nicolas Maduro. His rule was authoritarian, corrupt, and deeply entangled in criminal networks. But removal is not the same as transition. At present, there is no clear or coherent U.S. plan for how Venezuela is to be governed, stabilized, or economically revived in a post-Maduro period. Instead, policy appears to follow the build a plane while it's flying approach. The administration has signaled that it wants to avoid nation building and sustain engagement, yet it also implies that the United States can meaningfully influence outcomes from a distance. That tension remains unresolved. Historically, members, there are no successful examples of one country managing another's internal governance or economic direction without a sustained presence, military, diplomatic, development assistance, or a strong multilateral framework. Even early in the 20th century, U.S. experiences in the Caribbean are poor precedents, precisely because the U.S. presence in those cases was extensive. What makes the current approach especially problematic is the absence of a sustained enforcement capacity. Beyond the possible reimposition of sanction, there is little ability to enforce or credibly signal U.S. government governance or economic priorities. Now, this is not an argument for occupation or military operations. It is simply a statement of reality. Without troops, diplomats, development missions, or some form of international framework, U.S. leverage rests largely on rhetoric, sanctions, and limited economic engagement. Those tools can influence behavior at the margins, but they cannot manage a political or economic transition. This matters because the incentive structure inside post-Maduro centers of power in Caracas strongly favors resistance to meaningful reform. Political leaders rarely sign their own death warrants without serious pressure. Security forces, political operators, armed actors, and economic elites tied to state rents view democratic reform, independent institutions, and the rule of law not as neutral improvements, but as threats to their power, and in some cases their survival. As a result, we should expect tactical concessions rather than real transformation. Limited steps, especially in areas that Washington prioritizes, such as the oil sector, may be offered to ease pressure and buy time. At the same time, reforms will be delayed and repression will be selectively intensified, and hedging behavior deepened in expectation that the U.S. attention will eventually shift elsewhere. The oil sector illustrates the problem clearly. Serious investment requires predictable laws, enforceable contracts, and credible protections for capital. We are already seeing signs of resistance. Caracas has pushed back rhetorically against Washington, while reports point to heightened repression alongside selective concessions. These are not actions of a system confidently moving toward democracy. They're efforts to reassert control while limiting external influence. So the policy implications are clear. First, Congress should demand a clear strategic articulation from the administration. What is the end state that the United States seeks in Venezuela? And what benchmarks define progress toward democracy, human rights, and economic predictability? Second, members should press the administration to explain how it expects to influence governance and economic outcomes without a sustained U.S. presence and what limits it acknowledges as a result. If the embassy remains closed, what leverage does Washington believe it retains, and what outcomes is it prepared to forego? And finally, Congress should insist that support for democracy, human rights, and the Venezuelan societal political agency remain the organizing principle of U.S. policy, aligned with the demands expressed by Venezuelans themselves, not short-term stability or access to resources. Venezuela has an opportunity to move beyond authoritarianism, but without a realistic assessment of power, incentives, and limits, we risk mistaking leverage for control and aspiration for strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Meeks. Members of the committee, I welcome the opportunity to speak with you this morning. As you have heard, before joining the International Crisis Group, I was an attorney advisor at the U.S. Department of State, where I advised administrations of both parties on issues relating to the use of military force and war powers. My remarks this morning are informed by that experience. The weight of expert opinion and my own view is that the U.S. attack upon Venezuela was a usurpation of Congress's war powers under the U.S. Constitution and a clear violation of international law. The question now for Congress is what it does to reassert its own prerogatives and indeed constitutional responsibilities with respect to the use of military force to foreclose further unauthorized military action by this administration. As you're aware, the U.S. Constitution assigns the power to declare war and related war authorities to the Congress, okay? And it does so for very good reasons that remain relevant today as ever. It is precisely because going to war is one of the most consequential decisions that this country can make that the framers of the Constitution assign this to the collective decision-making of the legislature to be informed by public debate and deliberation rather than leaving it to the whims and preferences of one man. But this does not leave the country undefended. Of course, the President is Commander-in-Chief under Article 2 of the Constitution, but his authority is limited to use unilateral force in that capacity only to repel sudden attacks upon the United States, okay? Obviously, the attack upon Venezuela was not to repel a sudden attack upon the United States, nor even an imminent threat of one. Further, it had obviously no congressional authorization. As such, it implicates the 1973 War Powers Resolution, okay, which Congress enacted to reassert its own constitutional role with respect to war and peace. This 60-day clock for removing U.S. armed forces from hostilities under the War Powers Resolution was triggered, and in my view, that clock continues to tick. Okay, U.S. armed forces remain in a state of confrontation in the region, and the administration has repeatedly threatened additional military action against Venezuela, military action without congressional authorization. In my view, the attack upon Venezuela was a clear violation of international law. That is Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. The U.S. is not just a party to this treaty, it was the principal architect of this treaty, which forms a cornerstone of international law. Article 2.4 prohibits the use or threat of the use of force in international relations, subject to narrow exceptions, none of which are relevant here. And I want to emphasize this administration has not made any sort of serious argument that its actions in Venezuela complied with international law. Indeed, at the UN Security Council last week, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations didn't lay out any sort of real argument that the invasion was consistent with the UN Charter. And indeed, the legal opinion it relies upon suggests that the President can unilaterally, quote, override the UN Charter or otherwise disregard it. This matter is not just a matter of international law, but also U.S. constitutional constraints. Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution imposes upon the U.S. President a duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Those laws include not just the Constitution and statutes, but also treaties, including the UN Charter. At a minimum, faithful execution forbids blatant violation of the UN Charter. The U.S. disregard for the UN Charter in this military action has consequences far beyond Venezuela. The U.S. helped build, after World War II, the international legal structure, which the UN Charter is a cornerstone. And the U.S. action risks damaging that legal order, emboldening other countries to use military force in a predatory fashion against their neighbors, which could implicate U.S. partners and allies around the world. And further, as we've seen in the days after the incursion into Venezuela, it seems to have emboldened the U.S. president to threaten military action against a number of other countries, not just Venezuela, but Colombia, Mexico, Iran, and even a NATO ally. So how should Congress respond? It's important for Congress, again, to discharge its own constitutional responsibilities with respect to the use of military force. The people's elected representatives should publicly debate and deliberate over whether the country goes to war or uses military force. In the immediate term, there are resolutions posed in both houses of Congress to block further military action against Venezuela. And in addition, there are measures in both houses of Congress that would enable Congress to exercise its ultimate war power, the power of the purse. In the longer term, Congress should undertake structural reform of the 1973 War Powers Resolution, including to close supposed loopholes, shorten timelines, and impose automatic funding cutoffs. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll start out with a few questions, and then I'll go to Mr. Castro, who is the ranking member on the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee. But let me just ask this question. There's been past U.S. interventions that show where military action, absent sustained diplomacy also, can lead to protracted conflict, civilian harm, and regional destabilization. Now, this administration has sharply cut key instruments of U.S. soft power, especially from our State Department, no longer USAID, no longer U.S. Agency for Global Media that traditionally helps build resilience and support civil society and counter authoritarian narratives. That's something that's on the ground. Now, we don't have those things. So my question is, what are the risks of pursuing the removal of Maduro without laying that diplomatic groundwork and without those tools in place for managing the aftermath in Venezuela? I noted the month-long planning and rehearsing and understanding that our military, who did a great job, their job, what they did was following through, but it was very well planned. They had a strategy. They rehearsed it over and over and over again. But if you don't have a plan for afterwards, what are the risks that take place thereafter? I'll start with Mr. Shannon.
Thank you very much for the question. I believe we're seeing the risks right now. In other words, a military operation that was planned, practiced, and then executed was not matched by a diplomatic plan that was thought through. And so there's a degree of improvisation at this point where it appears the primary purpose is trying to avoid a significant long-term presence by the United States on the ground, especially the U.S. military, and a need to ensure some degree of order and stability. And so the administration has chosen to work with the remnants of the Maduro regime. The problem this creates is that this is the regime that the administration had vilified as criminal and as a part of a narco-trafficking network and a terrorism network. The people who have been designated, identified, indicted are still in place. And for Venezuelans who are looking for some kind of exit from a political conflict that has consumed that country for nearly 25 years, this is not the exit. And therefore the administration is going to find itself in a position in a very short term in which it is either locked into a relationship with a regime that is not consonant with U.S. interests, or it's going to have to present some plan for a process of political transition, and it has not been able to articulate that. And in the process, absent an open and functioning U.S. embassy in Caracas, absent the ability to surge American diplomats into Caracas, absent an ability to protect them while they're on the ground, absent a USAID, which would have been the natural conduit through which development assistance, accountable development assistance, would have been delivered. We are absent the tools that we would normally use in this kind of process. And so we are at a disadvantage. The regime knows that. They're at great risk right now because of our military might and because of the economic power we still hold over them. However, they operate with a mindset, which is that if they do not surrender, they cannot be beat. And their short-term goal will be that. It will be not to surrender. It will be to make the concessions that are necessary in order to survive, but to hold on to power, because by doing that they protect themselves and they limit the ability of their political opponents to gain any purchase within Venezuela.
Mr. Moore, you want to add anything to that?
Just briefly, Congressman, you indicated basically that there is no strategy here, and I think that's true. There is a sort of incongruence between the goals or what it's trying to achieve in Venezuela, even those are not very clear, and the means and tools. When you have that kind of mismatch between ends and means, you're bound to run into enormous challenges. That's on one side. The second is, and I want to sort of double down on something that Ambassador Shannon said. For the current regime, reform and concessions beyond some of the ones that have been provided is an existential threat for them. They lose everything, and not just power and economic resources and their corrupt networks. They lose everything. And they have done this in the past. They will hedge, they will delay, they will give some concessions, pull back. They will continue repression. We've seen in the last few days, Congressman, that the regime has heightened the levels of repression. Even as they're releasing some political prisoners, they're intensifying the wave of repression. People are being stopped and their phones are being taken to see who they've been interacting with and if in some way they're interacting or collaborating with the United States. They know that they can repress. If the administration is going to manage or run Venezuela as is indicated it's going to do, it's going to require a lot more resources that itself has dismantled, as you indicated, and therefore you have this incongruence between the stated objectives and goals and the means to achieve them. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to, well, let me ask this question to Mr. Finucane. It was recently reported that the United States used a civilian-disguised airplane to carry out strikes against alleged drug boats in the Caribbean. My question to you is, what are the legal ramifications of using U.S. military aircraft disguised to look like a civilian plane to launch a kinetic attacks? And why is this revelation so dangerous?
Thank you, Ranking Member. I think there's really a threshold problem with the approach that the administration has taken with these boat strikes, both in the Caribbean and the Pacific. That is to say that the administration has erroneously framed this killing spree at sea as an armed conflict and falsely asserted that it is governed by the law of armed conflict and somehow that justifies these premeditated killings. There is no armed conflict. The law of war does not apply here. And outside of armed conflict, we generally refer to premeditated killing as murder. Okay? And so the framing of these attacks as lawful combat, the framing of the use of this aircraft as perfidy under the law of war, that's misplaced and to some extent a red herring because the law of war just doesn't apply here. It is significant, however, that if the administration claims that the law of war applies here, and that is the operative legal framework, if they are taking actions inconsistent or which violate their own bogus legal framework, that should signal another layer of problems with the operation at sea. Is another reason for this legislature to conduct aggressive oversight of what the administration is up to and whether it's going to continue with the premeditated killing at sea.
Thank you, Ranking Member Meeks, and thank you so much for holding this hearing. It has been a real dereliction of duty for the Chairman and the Foreign Affairs Committee not to demand that the Secretary of State and the State Department come in front of our committee and testify about the administration's actions in Venezuela. So thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you, gentlemen, for your remarks here today. Mr. Finnecane, I wanted to ask you a question because I know that you worked in the Office of Legal Counsel at the State Department. The administration has made a case for war with Venezuela that has significantly pushed the envelope on the authority that a president claims. I had the opportunity, as I know many of my colleagues did yesterday, to review the classified OLC memo. What I saw really alarms me. A redacted and declassified version was posted online by the Department of Justice last night as well. And what do you see as the implications of this memo?
Well, one of the most troubling implications and serious implications is there is an assertion in this Department of Justice memo that the president can override or otherwise disregard international law, including the UN Charter, because it doesn't bind him. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, that is inconsistent with the U.S. Constitution, which requires the president to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, as well as establish that those laws include not just statutes and the Constitution itself, but also treaties, including the UN Charter. That was the understanding of both the Roosevelt and Truman administrations and the Senate that provided advice and consent to that treaty. So that's a pretty significant implication. More broadly, this opinion, it frames this operation as a law enforcement operation, and somehow that authorizes the use of the military in this dramatic fashion. Okay, but this is not framing it in these terms is misleading, as Ambassador Shannon said at the outset. Okay, this is a massive military operation in Venezuela. I have participated in joint law enforcement military operations of planning and execution and the analysis of those. This is unlike any of those that I participated in, and unlike those that are even referenced in the opinion itself. And I will also say that while the Department of Justice and aspects of the administration, elements of the administration may frame this as a law enforcement operation, the president himself has not used that characterization. He's been very outspoken that this is about the oil.
Well, thank you. I have been concerned for the last few years and have made remarks in committee, both in this committee and in the Intelligence Committee, about folks laying the groundwork for military action in Mexico. And President Trump, of course, over this past year, has ramped up that rhetoric, including after the strike on Venezuela. He's also alluded to strikes against Colombia, Greenland, Mexico, and perhaps others. What do you think that this portends, this action in Venezuela portends for war with Mexico or Colombia or other places? And then before y'all answer real quick, and Mr. Mora, you know the long history of U.S. intervention in Latin America. And post-Cold War, I think we kind of took stock of lessons learned about some of the mistakes that we made, including supporting some very abusive dictators during that time who abused their people and who harmed their people. There was a long period of Latin America of mass deaths, of disappearances, of civil wars, of violence, of mass migration to other countries in Latin America and to the United States. And this strikes me as a return to those days and a possible example of 21st century imperialism. So what does this portend for war with other places?
Well, I would just say on the first part of your question that based on this operation and the apparent tactical success of it and the president's love for military spectacle, he seems emboldened to use military force elsewhere in the region, including those countries that you mentioned.
Yes, thank you for the question, Congressman. At the end of the Cold War, there was a consensus that was built, a bipartisan consensus in the United States and in the region in support of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And there were a number of policies and inter-American instruments, like the Inter-American Democratic Charter, that institutionalized that commitment on the part of the region and the United States, bipartisan, to promote democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and markets. Democracy, as you know, has been weakening across the hemisphere. And I think what this administration is doing is, in a sense, trying to institutionalize, if you will, root this idea that our commitment to democracy is no longer a U.S. policy. The national security document makes that very clear, that we are not going to be promoting issues of democracy and human rights in the region. So that gives authoritarian leaders a sense that they might now, for the first time, perhaps in a very long time since the period you talked about, the United States is either willing to support or turn a blind eye to authoritarianism and violations of human rights in the hemisphere. And I think that's being understood loud and clear throughout the region.
Thank you. I yield back, Ranking Member.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Ranking Member, for putting this timely gathering together. You know, for months, Democrats on the House Foreign Affairs Committee repeatedly called for oversight of U.S. policy towards Venezuela. And yet, once again, Republicans have chosen to abdicate their constitutional responsibility, deferring to the White House instead of defending our oversight authority. And Ranking Member, you even invited Secretary of State Rubio and Deputy Secretary of State Landau, and it was not to grandstand, but to help the American people hear directly straight answers about what this administration is doing in Venezuela. So their refusal to not show up is not just disappointing, it's telling. It shows where their priority, where their agenda is, and it's not about transparency for the American people. Instead, I thank our experts for stepping up when Trump officials are shirking their responsibility. Now, let me be clear. Nicolas Maduro is an undemocratic despot. He's brutalized his own people, rigged elections to stay in power, and presided over a regime that starved and terrorized Venezuelans for decades. He deserves to face justice for all that he has done, but Maduro's crimes do not give Trump the blank check to commit more crimes or power to run another country, which he says to us, even with a Wikipedia post. What we are missing, what we are witnessing is not a coherent strategy. It is chaos. It is clear that Trump has no plan for what will happen next in Venezuela. His string of reckless gambits are exacerbating instability, violence, and suffering. Instead of empowering democratically elected leaders in Venezuela, Trump has repeatedly undercut them. And rather than reinforcing democratic institutions, Trump seems bent on empowering the very cronies who prop up Maduro's rule. This is not strategy, it's spectacle. And so let me restate what I think is obvious to all of us. Venezuela is a sovereign country. Its people deserve self-determination, respect for their democratic aspirations, control of their own resources, and not the theatrics that we see from ex post from the president and all the geopolitical grandstanding that we've become too accustomed to. And yet, Trump has made very clear where he's focused, controlling oil rather than promoting democracy. And time again, he is misleading the American public so that he can enrich his billionaire buddies in the oil industry. He's made it clear. If it were about drugs, as the president has claimed, Trump would not have pardoned former Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was convicted of trafficking hundreds of tons of cocaine into the United States. Again and again, his actions betray his stated intentions. Trump is taking a might makes right approach to foreign policy in Venezuela and around the world. But make no mistake, autocrats around the world are watching. When we abandon democratic norms, our principles and constitutional restraints, it does not make America stronger. It makes the world more dangerous. This echoes the same approach Putin uses when talking about Ukraine and that Xi Jinping uses when talking about Taiwan. So, Ambassador Shannon, given the breadth of your experience, what message do you think China and Russia are receiving from the president's actions, specifically the operation in Venezuela, and how does that impact their decisions towards both Taiwan and Ukraine?
Thank you very much. It's a great question. It's an important one. At the very even before President Trump took office, when he spoke of foreign policy, he spoke of it largely in terms of Canada, Greenland, and Panama. And he did so because he was attempting to re-articulate American purpose in the world and our security interests, which for him are our near neighborhood in our region. And we have seen this reiterated in the aftermath of the Venezuela raid and also the actions taken in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific against drug trafficking cartels. He's intent on showing that the U.S. military is going to be used in our near neighborhood to attack enemies that he believes have an immediate impact on the well-being of American communities. And as he does so, he has also approached both Russia and China as adversaries who have regional interests and ambitions that he believes need to be understood and respected. And in this regard, he is reshaping American foreign policy into one of spheres of interest and influence, as opposed to a global engagement by the United States in building political and economic processes that are designed to promote democracy and generate wealth and distribute wealth through the world, and create a world in which the United States can operate in peacefully and with prosperity. And in so doing, I think both the Chinese and the Russians hear echoes of their own thinking and believe that this is a United States that they're going to be able to work with in terms of affirming their own interests and their own purpose in their so-called spheres of interest and influence. The problem this is going to create for us is that we have overlapping alliances and partnerships that don't accept this sphere of influence view of the world, that don't accept that Russia or China or any other great power should have a degree of control or influence over them just because they're close to Russia or China or distant from the United States. In fact, one of the attractions that the United States has held for many countries around the world is that we provide not only support for political autonomy and for the political independence of these nations, but we also, through our economy, through our trade, through our investment, give them an opportunity to leapfrog out of whatever region they happen to be in order to engage with the larger global economy. And the shrinking of the United States, the intention of the administration to reshape the U.S. from a global hegemon into a regional hegemon, I believe is a bad portent for the world we're going to find ourselves living in.
So, in summary, more chaos as a result of these actions. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you for having the hearing. We should have been done with the full committee. I'm concerned that the actions of the new self-proclaimed acting president of Venezuela, President Trump, are built on prevarications and lies. We can talk about, whether Maduro's a bad guy, whether he isn't, but the lies and the evasiveness and the misleading that's being done, not just to Congress, but to the American public, is first and foremost in my mind. This isn't about drugs. It isn't about lethal fentanyl, because it's not coming from Venezuela. It's not about cocaine coming here. Most of it is headed to North Africa and then to Europe, where the cost of cocaine is $80,000 a kilogram versus $28,000 here. The incentive is to push that to Europe. It's certainly not about drugs when he pardons a drug dealer like Juan Orlando Hernandez, who's convicted of 400 tons of cocaine. And it's not about the boats that are akin to the boats I see outside of Cape Cod, recreational boats, 30, 35 feet. That's what they're targeting. And these are extrajudicial killings that are occurring there around those boats. I got to see the video of the second strike. The American public should see the video of the second strike. Every other primary video has been released. There's no security interest that prevents the American public from seeing. Again, misleading the American public about the actions that are there. They said it wasn't about regime change. They lied to this Congress time and time again, saying this isn't about regime change. All the while, months in planning to the detail of a replica building where Maduro was living so they could plan the extraction and the military action, yes, military action, taking him out of there. There's no consent to go in there. There's no self-defense factor. There's no authorization from the Security Council of the UN. Indeed, they're moving forward. And what I'm worried about now, with 20% of our military assets parked outside this area, where we're losing soldiers who are being killed in the Middle East, redeployed there and sitting there at a cost that they won't even share with the American public or even this Congress of doing that. My concern is, what's the next step here? And what I want to ask you is, with your background, I'm really concerned. We're moving in an embassy there. We're going to have to secure that embassy with American military protection and State Department protection. We're going to be dealing with a government where we're not on the ground, and yet I want all of you, just jump in whenever you can. I am so concerned about our troops having to be deployed there, because this is a tinderbox that's occurring there. You've got internally, you've had this before the Americans came in. You've got a tinderbox where you have three major groups at least there. You have the Ministry of the Interior, who has his own militia and is very popular politically in that regard, and has violent background. You have the Minister of Defense, and then you have the Vice President, now acting president, well, other acting presidents, I guess we have two now, that are there. And one of them has $25 million on their head. They're plotting, they're moving. If there's any kind of interaction there, which is almost predictable, how is the U.S. going to come in and intervene without troops on the ground, without risking our young men and women in the military? What's that threat that they're internally, that we're not doing anything to plan for?
Thank you, Congressman. You're right. There are multiple armed groups, some of them aligned with the regime and others that are not aligned with the regime, engaged in economic activities, engaged in just illicit mining, for example, protection money, etc. So these groups don't have loyalty oftentimes to any single political group or political center. And if there is, and I said if, there is a collapse of that regime, if that regime decides to break down and loses control over at least urban areas, you could very well see in a scenario, worst case scenario, a kind of civil war or civil conflict among these different armed groups. Not for any ideology, I would say, but really for control of territory, control of resources, etc. And as I indicated in my remarks, in my statement, the regime is trying to do everything possible to try to get the president to forget about Venezuela. Perhaps the calculation is if we give them something along the lines of the petroleum industry, that will be enough for the president to declare victory, and we can wage, we can hedge, we can delay, and ultimately stay in power. And therefore control these armed groups if it's necessary, right? That's a scenario that they are banking on. But to end my comments, Congressman, I think we are in a very fluid, dynamic, and uncertain situation. We can play all kinds of scenarios and options here, but we really don't know what's likely to happen, because the administration, as we all have indicated, doesn't have a roadmap, doesn't have a strategy, did not plan the day after. And I suspect I haven't done that yet.
Well, as I yield back my time, I'm over it. This is a 5-year or longer projection here to go down the road you're talking about with oil. Our troops are going to be in jeopardy. And mark my words, the threat of them being drawn in is very serious. And all the while, we're being misled. The American public's being misled. I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Meeks, for calling this special hearing. I'm going to start out with a very obvious fact. If Donald Trump's Venezuela operation was good for America, why are Republicans afraid to talk about it? Why are Republicans afraid to have any hearings on it? It's because they know Donald Trump's Venezuela operation has been a disaster. And so I'm just going to get out some basic facts. I'm going to ask Ambassador Shannon these questions, but anyone on the panel can answer them. What is the approximate population of Venezuela? 28 to 30 million people, right?
28 to 30 million.
Okay. PBS issued a report that said about 80% of that population lives in poverty. About 8 in 10 Venezuelans live in poverty. Would you agree with that?
I would.
Okay. And you have roving armed militias running around Venezuela. Is that correct?
Correct, especially in the
so
city.
Donald Trump has posted that he is acting president of Venezuela. And under Donald Trump's leadership as acting president of Venezuela, the U.S. Department of State has now warned and told all Americans of Venezuela to evacuate immediately because these roving militias are trying to search out for Americans and target them. Is that correct?
It's a very dangerous environment, yeah.
Can you say that again?
It's a very dangerous environment, yes.
Okay. But the U.S. leader issued a public warning telling Americans to leave Venezuela immediately. Is that correct?
It's my understanding, yes.
Yeah, okay. Now, Venezuela's infrastructure also sucks. Is that right?
That's a technical term, yes.
Okay,
yeah.
so the oil industry has reported that the pipelines of Venezuela are aging and needs significant repair. Is that correct?
It's a 20th century oil operation, not a 21st century oil
Okay,
operation.
the power grids in Venezuela often don't work and they need significant repair. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. The oil extraction facilities in Venezuela need significant investment in repair. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Experts have said that to repair this infrastructure is going to take decades, 15, 20 years. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would.
Okay. The CEO of Exxon has said that Venezuela is uninvestable at a recent White House meeting. He was correct. So I'm going to now speak to the other oil company CEOs, and I'm going to tell you what you have. You've got a country where 80% of people live in poverty. You got roving bands of armed militias that the government can't control, and you're going to put your employees in that country and invest in that country and hope they don't get killed? That's crazy. But in addition, you're going to need 2 decades of investment to make this even work out. The only way that works is you got to believe you're going to have a Republican trifecta for 2 decades. And guess what? Later this year, there'll be an election for a new Congress. In less than 3 years, there'll be an election for a new president. If you believe there's going to be a Republican trifecta that's going to guarantee you 2 decades of secure investment in Venezuela, you are crazy and stupid. And if you make that investment, I guarantee you, I'm going to play clips of this hearing when your board fires you later on. I yield back.
Thank you so much for having this hearing, Ranking Member. And I represent South Florida. This issue is very personal for us. Many of us in our community, we're used to seeing the price of dictators and authoritarian countries, and we're not living in a fantasy that removal of Maduro automatically changes what happens in Venezuela. In fact, we actually know it actually gets worse. My family comes from Haiti, and I remember growing up as a young child, hearing about how my favorite aunt was arrested and beaten up. I would hear stories about my uncle who was outspoken, who was murdered by the following regime. And it seems for us to have real change in Venezuela, we need a real thought-out plan. And I haven't seen a thought-out plan, which we talked about. But also, not living in the fantasy, we know that this commitment is going to take more than 5 to 10 years. It can actually take decades. And if it is not done correctly, we could be looking at a country that is another failed state and that the narco traffickers actually grow. So I wanted to dive into what is the state of play right now in Venezuela. Who is on the ground? What are some of the organizations who are there? And from your knowledge, have they been surrendering or submitting to this administration? Because when we talk to the administration or hear from them, they're living in this assumption that everybody would kneel to their will and that everything's going to be okay because they are holding off their oil. But we've seen this before, and we know that this is not how this usually plays out. Could anybody respond to the state of play and who's actually on the ground in Venezuela to be disruptive?
Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to start the responses. There are very few people on the ground. The U.S. government is not on the ground. Absent Chevron, there are no U.S. oil companies on the ground. I don't believe there are any U.S. oil service providers on the ground at this point in time. And there are, sure, I'm sorry, there are some entities that work on issues related to crisis management and political transition that have Venezuelans on the ground working with them. So there's some understanding of the dynamic on the ground. But the truth of the matter is, aside from the few diplomatic missions that are still present in Caracas, there is no structure to engage with the Venezuelan government, engage with the democratic opposition, engage with the business community, engage with civil society to understand the context in which we're operating right now, or what comes next. And this is worrisome because it means that the Trump administration has to work through a regime or a government that it has already vilified. And the question is, how can you undertake and manage any kind of political transition? I understand the real anguish of your constituents. Up to 1/4 of Venezuela has fled the country and is living either in the United States, in Colombia, in Panama, in Spain, or beyond. And many are waiting for an opportunity to return, but they want that opportunity to be secure, and they want to have a chance not only to live freely and democratically, but also to prosper. And we don't have a transition plan that points in that direction at this moment.
Approximately how many years do you think that it would take to have a successful Venezuela? And I ask this because you're right. Everybody who left Venezuela has this dream of going home, just like my parents and my family has. And they've had this dream of going home to Haiti now for 50 years. And I've seen many of them pass away, never attaining that dream of going home. And looking at Venezuela in the state of play right now, without the scaffolding, without the program, without us even having a plan, it seems like that dream might not be achieved by Venezuelans who are living here today, because they might even pass. So do you believe this is a 5 to 10 year, or is this more of decades worth of investments if we do not actually have a real plan going forward?
Well, Hugo Chavez was elected in 1999, and the political conflict that we have been viewing really emerges in the early parts of the century. So we've had 25 years of political conflict in Venezuela that has had an economic impact that is worse than most wars would have, which is what leads to so many people fleeing. So it's going to take a long time to rebuild, a long time to restructure laws, norms, and regulations that draw in investment and create economic growth. However, Venezuelans are remarkable people, and they have an ability to respond to chaos and catastrophe and find a way forward. But what they need is a measure of hope. What they need is a belief that they have a voice in what their future is going to look like, and it's not going to be imposed on them either by a regime or by a foreign government. And this is what worries me at this point, because we have not laid out anything that's going to give them hope that they can go back to their country to rebuild it. In other words, I don't think they're waiting for the rebuild to be done, and then they're going to kind of parachute in after 25 years or whatever. I think if they're given an opportunity to begin to rebuild now, they'll go back. But that's what they need. They need a vision.
Well, I pray that this administration will work with this Congress so we can actually put a plan together, and that the Venezuelans can actually achieve their dream of returning home. Thank you.
Just to say that it's one thing to build a road or a petroleum infrastructure, but to rebuild institutions, which are critical, is much harder to do, and it takes a lot more time.
I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chairman Meeks, for your courage and your character in calling this necessary hearing. Thank you, gentlemen, for your participation this morning and your marvelous insights. I, like you, woke up horrified to realize that America had invaded, extradited. Can't say it's an extradition. It was a kidnapping, an arrest. I'm not even quite sure what it is. I don't know if President Maduro had a visa to come into the United States. I don't know if this is the new world, and I just saw the complete paradigm of the United Nations and all these accords and all of this great body of work of nations settling differences after World War II, 80 years of precedents now being torn up. I represent Illinois' 1st Congressional District, based on large concentration on the south side of Chicago. Over the last 2 years, we've had a number of migrants from Venezuela to come from Texas to being unlawfully shipped, kidnapped, children transported within domestic U.S. territory, all the way to Chicago. Some 30,000 residents. Have two-part question. Number one is the future of migration that you would anticipate to come from Venezuela, that I've seen this mass exodus and 3 million people going into Colombia. How many more people would you anticipate going into Mexico or Brazil as a result of this level of instability will be the first question, and then I'll wait to give you the second. And I know it's purely speculative.
No, I understand, and thank you for the question, but it's an important one because so many Venezuelans have fled the country. And I think so much depends on what happens next in Venezuela. As I noted earlier, if there is some degree of hope that Venezuela will stabilize, that it will grow economically, and that Venezuelans will have a role to play in their country's future, then I think the migration stops. I think people decide to stay and try to make the best of it. But we're not there yet. And it's important to understand, looking back historically, in 2003, when Saddam Hussein was deposed as leader of Iraq, there was a period of euphoria and a period of belief that Iraq was now suddenly in charge of its own future and that it was going to rebuild itself in a new and different way. But 5 months after U.S. troops roared into Baghdad, the beginnings of an insurgency launched a bombing attack on UN headquarters in Baghdad and began an insurgent war against the United States, which then morphed into a civil war. And that has had consequences that have generated significant migration in Iraq and beyond. And one has to worry that absent clear direction, absent vision, and absent political engagement by the United States in Venezuela, that Venezuela itself could crack, and political volatility could generate more internal conflict, which would then generate more migration. So it really all depends on what we do over the next bunch of months.
Thank you.
Congressman, yes, there's an expectation problem here, Congressman. I really don't think that time is on our side. I think the Venezuelan people inside the country and outside the country have huge expectations that this will lead to democratic transition soon. The Economist just published a poll this morning, or maybe it was yesterday, where it indicated that a majority of Venezuelans within Venezuela expect an election within 6 months. My question is, when that does not happen and people become disillusioned and frustrated, will they leave the country? Or will they stay? It strikes me that with all this conversation that we've had, that the administration has had, and working with the current regime, that there's no conversation about the role of the Venezuelan people in all this, right? They want democracy. They want the results that we saw in July of 2024 executed. And it seems from this administration that they're not interested in that. As you know, the president was asked about a democratic transition, and he said it might take years. That must have, I've not consulted the Venezuelan people, but that must have fallen on the Venezuelan people like a bomb, right? That I'm going to have to live with this now for the next, 2-3 years? And if they feel that, the possibility for migration increases.
And the last question is, I've gone to Venezuela on several occasions, and Caracas to Chicago is 2,504 miles. You can walk it, drive it, bicycle it, whatever you choose. So I see the continuity. And my concern about the oil companies, and I was a bit insulted to see the President Trump, Chairman Meeks, he tells on Air Force One in an interview the other day that he didn't like the answer from the CEO of Mobil Exxon, so he will exclude him. He thought he was being too cute. is what he told one of the premier oil companies and executives. Mind you, this is when we started this last administration, the Trump administration, to start with Rex Tillerson as a key economic advisor, and by the time his administration was over, it ended up with Mr. Pillow being his key economic advisor. So I'd like to find the hope, and I'm not getting that from you. I feel the same way as you. Can you leave me with some hope on what is the best of a worst situation that we can anticipate? I mean, it's ugly, but there's got to be a daybreak. What can we dream of, if you would like to share some with the Venezuelan people? It's not meant to be easy.
I'll be brief, Congressman. I think that if the United States insists that the Venezuelan people and the democratic opposition in Venezuela begin a dialogue with the regime, if we're going to work with this regime, if that's the conclusion of this administration, that those conversations begin and that a roadmap, a framework be established for a transition, and that the United States insist upon that. That might happen after tomorrow's meeting between the President and Maria Corina Machado. I'm not sure. But I think the United States should insist that that conversation and that process begin now.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, for convening this meeting and doing the oversight that Republicans refuse to do. It is so important that we continue to call out Trump's invasion and takeover of Venezuela for what it is. He is dragging us into a full-throttle imperialist foreign policy where the United States is the malign actor on the world stage. It is disastrous, it is dystopian, it is destabilizing, and the American people need to understand what's at stake if this president is not reeled in. We're talking war, we're talking exploitation, and we could be talking dead Americans. There's a reason why we don't do occupations or colonies, because the history of military interventionism and regime change costs thousands of American lives, trillions of American dollars, and it creates a backlash around the world. We've seen this movie. We know how it ends. We need to write another ending to this script. I have a few questions. Many of them have already been answered, so I appreciate you. Ambassador Mora, earlier you talked about the goals are not clear, but in my mind, I think the goal is crystal clear. In one of his press conferences, the president mentioned oil 27 times, and he never mentioned the word democracy. So can you sort of talk about the challenges, that's putting it nicely, of an oil-first, sort of oil-only foreign policy that we seem to have right now with Venezuela?
For any investment, Congresswoman, you need a framework. You need stability. You need predictability. If the country is immersed in chaos and instability, it's very difficult to begin to invest in a country like that. And so there is, again, an incongruence between the stated goal, which is to extract and increase and extract oil and gas from Venezuela, and the institutional infrastructure capacity required to do such a thing over the long term. You cannot disconnect economic growth or development from the political environment. If we disregard or neglect the political context, and there is no democratic transition, there is no stability, then it will be very difficult for Exxon and others to invest. I think, Congressman, the bet that their administration is making, and I want to I'm speculating, is that with a regime such as the one that's in power now and has been in power for 25 years, that regime can maintain stability, can maintain order, that the United States can work with this regime to ensure that the order that is required to extract resources is necessary. But then our commitment to democracy is clearly...
Mr. Finucane, and I'm going to try to get to each of you, so hopefully we can all be cognizant of the time. I too was alarmed by the sheer size of this military operation. I mean, it sounded like to me a full throttle takeover of a country. B, I've been deeply concerned about Tulsi Gabbard's disappearance in all of this. I mean, where is she? We need an APB out on her. And C, incredibly concerned at how DOJ is now maneuvering the charges and what they're like trying to figure out what's going to stick, because I believe they already know this is wrong. So can you just what does this say about the legitimacy of this entire operation, A, but also given the DOJ's, decision to prosecute Maduro on a four-count indictment that excludes the chief justification for this airstrike being the FTO designation. What does it say about the legitimacy of the FTO designation?
This administration has cycled through a number of justifications for potential military action in Venezuela, from immigration to supposed fentanyl to the supposed terrorism ties or terrorism status of Maduro and the so-called Cartel de los Soles, and ultimately they landed on the oil marketing. I think the removal of the Cartel de los Soles allegation in the indictment suggests they did not want to try to stand up in court and justify it.
And Ms. Ambassador Shannon, final question. Please indulge me, Ranking Member. We on the Foreign Affairs Committee are always trying to thread the needle about diplomacy and why it's important, why people should care. Why should the American people care about what is happening to Venezuela and what we are doing to Venezuela?
Well, first, because it has almost an immediate impact here, as noted in terms of migrants fleeing Venezuela, but also in terms of the stability of the Greater Caribbean in this instance, which is our third border, and an area of important economic activity for us. But maybe more importantly, it's important to understand that across the last several decades, in a bipartisan way and across Republican and Democratic presidencies, the United States has helped build out in the Western Hemisphere a region of countries at peace with each other, that have found peaceful ways to resolve disputes, that have negotiated trade and investment deals, that have generated impressive economic growth across time, that have built strong middle-class communities in large economies like Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and beyond, and in the process have created a strategic reserve for the United States for an area that shares our commitment to democracy, shares our understanding of the importance of market economies and the way in which economic growth is driven by trade and regional integration, and have, in creating this strategic reserve, have created, I think, a platform, a democratic, market-oriented platform that allows the United States to address larger strategic concerns elsewhere in the world with a degree of peace and security in our own hemisphere. And that was the product of diplomacy. That was the product of investment and trade. It was the product of engagement by our private sector and our civil society in our hemisphere. It was not the product of military action. And that's what we will lose.
Thank you, Mr. Ranker. And I just want to say, Congressman, that I deeply appreciate that you took the time and that you gentlemen took the time to be here to have this dialogue. I've been in 4 other legislative bodies before my service in the House. I have never seen a committee structure that avoided the major issues that needed to be discussed. We have to discuss Venezuela. We have to discuss Greenland. We have to discuss tariffs. We have to discuss Ukraine. We're not discussing any of those things. So, Mr. Leader, your leadership on this is essential. Gentlemen, I have one question. It's simple, but it's complicated, and I'm asked this question. How much do you think it's going to cost for the American involvement in Venezuela after this action? I have been asked that by people, and I have no way to even begin to put my hands around the price tag. And of course, since we don't know what the actions of the country will be. You don't even know how to cost it out, but whether you're drawing off of our Iraq experience or Afghanistan experience or just your own personal knowledge of what goes into this, what do I tell somebody? What could the price tag be for this American involvement now that the military stuff is over and now that we have to deal with what's left? What do you think?
That's a tough one to answer, Congressman. I don't know. It depends, as you indicated, as to what exactly we will be doing. If for some reason there is a breakdown in the social order in Venezuela, will this administration introduce U.S. troops to stabilize Venezuela? That would be very, very costly in many ways. But if the United States refuses to engage in the kind of nation building that we've seen in the past, then the cost will not be as high. I suspect, and I'm speculating, Congressman, that this administration wants to do nation building on the cheap. And you don't do that. As I indicated in my statement, you can't engage in what seems to be their objectives by not engaging, by not having a presence there. So they have to decide what is it exactly they want in Venezuela. Unless, as I indicated, they're thinking that they can basically extract from this regime what they want from an economic standpoint, while the regime is able to maintain order. So we've been complicit in supporting a regime that we consider to be illegitimate.
I can't put a number on it, but I would just refer you to Afghanistan and Iraq. And although we don't currently have troops on the ground and we don't have the structures in place that we attempted to build in Afghanistan and Iraq, we might find ourselves driven in this direction. And so that's an outer boundary. The inner boundary depends on the president himself. As he describes what he seeks to do in Venezuela, it's almost an image of the East India Trading Company, which the British used to run India, which was not the crown itself. It was a joint stock operation, but it had its own army, it had its own governance structures. But I don't think we'll be successful in that because we won't have the support of the region in building this out, and we won't have the kind of control that the British had in South Asia at the time. So I'm sorry I can't give you an exact number, but you can tell your constituents that their grandchildren will be paying for it.
Congressman, if I could, as the ambassadors have said, it really depends on what the administration has in mind, but just to give you a scale of the challenge, even if the administration is exclusively focused on the oil sector, this is a statistic I got yesterday. This is a statistic I got yesterday from doing a briefing with an expert on Venezuela's oil sector. And what she said is that to get back to peak production, 3.1 million barrels, it would take 10 years and $100 billion. That's focused solely on oil.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Meeks, for holding this very important conversation. I will begin by joining my colleagues in expressing my profound disappointment that the majority still to this day has refused to bring the Trump administration before Congress to provide the American people with the transparency they deserve on an issue that is critical to our national security. I'll echo Representative Liu. If this is such a good thing for America, why are we hiding from it? So again, thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, for your leadership in convening us today. Before I get to the specific issue at hand, I want to take a step back and look at the bigger picture and some of the conversation around costs and oil a little bit. Data from the nonprofit and nonpartisan Economic Policy Institute tells us that last year was the worst job creation numbers in America for a non-recession year in 2 decades. Credit card debt is at record highs. Homelessness is at record highs. Americans are paying significantly more for energy, for childcare, for groceries. In fact, nearly half of Americans cite the cost of living as their biggest personal challenge this year, outpacing health concerns, housing, and politics. Failing to make good on its promise to lower costs on day one, the Trump administration has instead blown through hundreds of millions of dollars on a military operation without congressional authorization, and more alarmingly, as we've discussed today, no plan for what happens next. Even before the capture of Maduro, reports indicate that the naval blockade of Venezuela alone has already cost American taxpayers roughly $700 million, and that tab grows by about $9 million every single day. That $700 million could have been used to provide a year of food assistance for nearly 350,000 Americans, annual rental assistance and services for more than 80,000 American veterans, annual comprehensive Medicaid-style health care coverage for nearly 90,000 Americans. So my question to start to Ambassador Shannon and Mora, I'm just curious first how this spending compares to humanitarian and development work USAID and the State Department historically have done in Venezuela. And can you talk about why the State Department's and USAID's work in Venezuela and its work around supporting civil society and democracy has been so cost effective?
Thank you very much for the question. $700 million is a lot of money, and $9 million a day is a lot of money. I can remember telling one of my colleagues in the White House during the Bush administration that if at the time I was senior director for Western Hemisphere affairs in the National Security Council, that if I could get our budget for Iraq for a single month and use it in Latin America, people would be building statues to President Bush in public plazas throughout the region. And I can tell you that if this kind of money were used to teach people English, to give them trade skills, to get jobs, to provide potable water, to ensure mother and child health, to address any of the immediate and necessary development needs that the United States has been addressing across decades, the political impact would be significant, and we wouldn't need military interventions.
That's more.
I think it will be more expensive in the long term, depending on what the administration decides to do, Congressman. Because in many ways, as the ranking member and others have said, we have dismantled all our many of our tools like USAID and others who could have been very helpful now in Venezuela in helping to reconstruct, provide technical assistance, institutional support. We do not have that tool. So I'm not sure how the president plans to, he says, rebuild Venezuela. How is he going to actually manage the finances of Venezuela? The State Department, as you know, has lost about 1,300 members. So, again, there is a disconnect between what the president is seeking to do, apparently, and our ability to do it because of policies taken by this administration to dismantle our soft power tools as well as some of our development tools.
Really powerful responses there. Thank you both for that. Just really incredible the ways in which we've missed opportunities through other means to better utilize that money, not just in Venezuela, but throughout the world, and also the ways in which we are ignoring the needs of the American people in the process, too. So I really appreciate your presence and your response here. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. And I think we all lament that the full committee of which we are members of has not sought to thus far provide the oversight that this committee is supposed to on all things that involve foreign relations with our country. Thank you, our panel here. I don't want to retread ground that's already been covered. I mean, we all agree that Maduro was bad news, and thankful that the U.S. military, with their expertise, were able to remove this guy and his wife, but still the regime is there, and still what we've learned is that it wasn't about drugs and it wasn't about regime change, but it's about oil. And I don't understand, because the fact is that you're not going to reduce the price of especially this high viscosity oil that is difficult to extract, has a limited market value, and energy companies in the United States, around the world, and our allies in the Middle East, this isn't no secret. They have no interest in driving oil prices below $60, $70 a barrel, period. There's no profit motive once you do that. And I know from my folks out in California, Chevron, they who have the biggest tentacles here in Venezuela, have had all sorts of issues and loss of money along with Exxon. And I can guarantee you they're not going to be willing to make the investment without certain guarantees by this administration and this president that ultimately is going to involve security, a lot of money, and putting risk of American lives. That's the bottom line if this policy is to be pursued. But I don't think it's clear, and that's why this oversight is so important, what the policy direction is by this president, whether we're talking about Venezuela, whether we're talking about the Middle East, whether we're talking about Ukraine. Why? Because he's acknowledged it on several occasions. He's operating on instinct. Well, I don't know where in the hell instinct falls in line in terms of a coordinated, thoughtful, reflective foreign policy that involves the best interests of our country as well as our allies. And that clearly is what's lacking. There is no plan. There's no plan. It's improvised day to day based upon what shiny object he can detour, based upon how he perceives the political world he's living in. That's the bottom line. So let me ask you, under lessons learned, I spent a lot of time with some of my colleagues with our involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned there in terms of commitments. Ambassador Brimmer was given a lot of money to walk around, we so say, and we know where that led. I spent time with Ambassador Crocker during that whole challenging times in trying to figure out how we were going to make a democracy out of a country that had no history of democratic institutions. Where do you see this going here without a plan in Venezuela? What are the lessons learned from our previous involvements in the Middle East that breaking things up are easy to do, but trying to fix things and promote democracy and human rights and the values we share are far more difficult?
Thank you very much for the comment and the question, and I'll start by saying that Venezuela is a country over time that has been deinstitutionalized. It has an important democratic history, and Venezuelans are indeed democratic in their culture and in their politics and how they understand themselves and the history of their country. But the breakdown of institutions, the breakdown of political structures and parties, and the increasing use of repression by the regime has created a vacuum, a political vacuum in the country that has to be addressed. And it can only be addressed through a reconciliation process internally and through democratic processes.
And that's all what's lacking. There is a plan.
And there is no plan for this.
And getting not only the Congress to buy into this plan, but the American people.
Correct.
And it's why it's so frustrating here. And it's why I think we have to continue to shine the light on the involvement here and around the world. What is Americans' policy? It can't be on instinct based upon one fella down the road here on Pennsylvania Avenue. I mean, that's not how this process is supposed to work.
It's worth comparing and contrasting the U.S. policy in Iran right now, because effectively what's happening in Venezuela is that the U.S. government is working with the regime that it's just removed the regime's leader, is working with that regime in order to maintain a degree of order and stability while it works out a plan. Whereas in Iran, it's egging on the Iranian people and telling them to go to the streets and that we're coming and that we'll protect you. They're very distinct messages. They're very different messages. And you have to ask yourself why.
Well, those are the hard questions we're asking. I've extended beyond my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But I think the fact of the matter is that there is no consistent foreign policy by this administration. It's all emanating from one person, and it's all ad lib, the best that we can determine, and the American people are suffering the effects of it, as well as the rest of the world.
Thank you, Ranking Member, and I share my colleague's concern how troubling it is that the full committee is not having the benefit of this conversation. I feel privileged to be a part of it. But we, as members of Congress, and you have argued for this, we have a responsibility, especially in matters of war. So thank you for doing this. Ambassador Shannon, we were last together at the Gates Forum. It is lucky me to be with you again. Ambassador Mora, good to see you again. And Mr. Finucane, thank you all for your decades of service. I know we're here to talk about Venezuela and our actions there and our failure of planning and actions, but what is constantly ringing in my mind are the concepts of truth and thoughtfulness and our standing in the world. We are in such a precarious place when we cannot count upon this administration to tell the American people the truth or to say the same story today as they say this evening or tomorrow. So we're really up against it, and it troubles me greatly. It troubles my constituents. Ambassador Shannon, I was thinking about where you began, because it's literally what I thought about when the press conference began right after the strike. The president said in his opening remarks this was a military action. And then you saw Secretary Rubio say it was a law enforcement action. And they have been at odds with those messages over and over again. Why did you choose to start your testimony today, conversation with us really, about that characterization by the administration, not the president consistently, that it's a law enforcement action?
Well, it's great to see you again. Thank you very much, and thank you for the question. I did so because Venezuela has been a political live wire for quite a while. It's been a source of debate within the U.S. body politic, within the U.S. Congress, within the U.S. administration for many years, and it has all revolved around democracy in Venezuela, protection of human rights, and respect for the rules and norms and regulations necessary for successful investment in Venezuela. And the degree to which we could work with Nicolas Maduro and his government or regime in order to accomplish purposes and address political conflict inside of Venezuela. And when we move against a leader like that, when we take a dramatic military action that has the potential to break open the political stasis that Venezuela had found itself in and actually begin to move towards some kind of solution, for us then to pretend that this wasn't an unusual and dramatic military action, that it didn't have a profound political impact in Venezuela and beyond, but was just picking up a criminal somewhere where we happened to find him, I found was disingenuous, to say the least. And it did not share with the American people the opportunity of the moment, which was how do we harness the energy and the intent of the Venezuelan people to allow them to reshape their country in a way that would benefit us. Instead, we're stuck in a moment in which we are working with the very same people we just attacked.
And of course, those frameworks have never been discussed with the American people, let alone Congress. The administration has never brought that level of thoughtfulness, preparation, planning the next day to this. Ambassador Morrow, and I think I really want to pose this to all of you. You mentioned the incongruence between the stated purpose and actual underlying apparent purposes. And I think about Mr. Finucane, your talk, your understanding of what is legal and what is not, and thank you for raising those issues to us. We have a very important role to play. Maybe I'll say this to all of you. If you were inside this administration, based on your decades of experience, and I'm saying you're in this administration, with what we know about their ambitions and their planning and their thoughtfulness or their lack of it or their attention, what would you do to persuade them? And we'll just stay here because we could talk about Iran, we could talk about Greenland, we could talk about USAID. What would you do at this moment to persuade this administration to take a different course?
As Ambassador Shannon indicated, Congresswoman, and thank you for your important question, what happens in Venezuela has regional implications, right? We cannot contain crisis in Venezuela just within Venezuela. It can spill over, it has spilled over. And so we need to be thinking, something that we've not talked about is how do we work with our regional partners to gain their support for a democratic Venezuela. And the second thing I would say, Congresswoman, is, as I said earlier, we need to think about how do we empower and we embolden the Venezuelan people so that they have agency, so that they have a role to play in their future and their destiny. We cannot dismiss the opposition. We can't say they're not ready for prime time. It's their future, it's their destiny, and I believe that the stability of Venezuela depends on our commitment, clear commitment, public commitment to democracy in Venezuela, in the region, something that it's clearly not a priority for this administration.
Mr. Finucane?
The way I would frame it is in terms of the president's own stated interests. If the president wants to win a Nobel Peace Prize, bombing a new country every week seems a poor plan to win one. I would also frame it in terms of the president's decades-long expressed expertise in nuclear non-proliferation of all things. The president claims to be an expert on that. Well, threatening the use of military force against other countries, threatening them with conquest and annexation, at the same time as undermining U.S. defense alliances, that seems to be a recipe for furthering nuclear proliferation around the globe.
I thank you all for that. There's so much more I'd love to discuss with you. I hope we'll have further opportunity. And I think you're right. I think it's tomorrow's meeting with Maria Machado is going to be so important. Perhaps she will offer her Peace Prize to the president, understanding what is persuasive in this administration. And I say that not flippantly, but I think the exact same thing, Mr. Finucane. If this president wants to be a man of peace, show us your cards. Be a man of peace. This is not what he is interested in, as he threatens he's armed and ready in Iran, and he'll get Greenland by whatever force, and as he dismantled USAID. So I thank you all.
Thank you, and let me thank all three of you in closing for appearing here today. You know, what your testimony has made clear is that the United States actions in Venezuela will have a long tail, that the story does not end at one operation, and that what comes next in the months, maybe years, and even decades will indeed be the legacy of this Trump imperialism, in my estimation. It's an abdication of our congressional responsibility to not conduct timely oversight over this administration's Venezuelan policy, I should say, and to ensure the actions this administration has taken is in the best interest of the American people. As Colin Powell once said to President George W. Bush on the Iraq War, if you break it, you own it. And the Trump administration will own the mess they've created, and there's no amount of hiding behind closed doors that will change that. I only wish that we would be able to have open hearings. I wish this was not just Democrats. I wish this was Democrats and Republicans. I wish that they would have had other witnesses from the administration side to give their point of view. That's what we're here for as members of Congress. That is why it is important that we conduct our oversight responsibilities, because if there was no Congress, there would be no oversight. We were created to make sure that one person could not rule and just do whatever he or she wants. We are not the Duma of Russia. We don't want to be and make the same mistakes that some countries have made to allow a democratic country turn to an autocratic country. That's what Congress is all about. And your being here today is tremendously helpful. And I know all of the members that were here benefited from you and your testimony. Thank you for your service to our country. Thank you for what you do and continue to do every day. And with that, we'll adjourn this shadow hearing.